Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large. This is show number 59, brought to you on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and of course with video on YouTube on my Critical Thinker at Large YouTube channel. I want to thank you for coming around. I think we're going to have a great show this week. We have a special guest from MuckRock, and this has to do with a very, very interesting topic. So let's go ahead and get right into it. Prisons. This is not just a big problem, but is a big business. According to the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics, 2.2 million people are incarcerated in U.S. federal and state prisons and county jails. We have the largest prison population in the world. This is in addition to the 4.7 million who are on probation or parole. According to a 2014 Human Rights Watch report, tough on crime, mandatory sentencing, and three strikes laws adopted since the 1980s have filled U.S. prisons with mostly nonviolent offenders. This policy failed to rehabilitate prisoners, and many were worse on release than before incarceration. Rehabilitation programs for offenders can be more cost-effective than prison. About half the state prison population and only about 8% of those in federal prison are there for violent crimes. However, since 1980, the number of incarcerated drug offenders has increased 12-fold due to war on drugs policies, which anyone with eyes and ears can see was not a winning strategy. Since the war on drugs was declared, marijuana has been legalized in Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, and Washington. Yet how many people who are in prison in those states for marijuana possession have been released? Try none, for no good reason at all except that the governors of those states can't be bothered. So we continue to spend $20,000 a year per prisoner to keep them locked up. From 1925 until 1975, the incarceration rate stayed roughly in the range of 200 per 100,000 people. This radically changed, and over the past 16 years has risen to 900 per 100,000 people. In sheer numbers, this means the number of incarcerated has gone up from 500,000 to nearly 2.2 million. Most of this increase in U.S. federal and state prisons, although the county jail population has also more than doubled over this same period. Our highest point was in 2008, but it's not gone down much since then. Statistically, there is less violent crime now than in decades, but an analysis done shows that this is not a direct effect of putting more and more people in prison. Quoting from a February 2015 article in The Guardian, researchers at the Brennan Center for Justice placed crime statistics from all 50 states over the past 4 decades against 13 other potential explainers of crime reduction, including decreases in alcohol consumption, growth in income, and data-driven policing techniques. The conclusion was that the sharp increase in prison numbers has had a negligible effect on the downward trend in crime, with mass incarceration responsible for around 6% of property crime reduction in the 1990s and less than a single percentage point in the 2000s. The report's authors were careful to argue that incarceration can have a positive impact on crime reduction, but imprisoning people at the levels experienced over the past 2 decades has only a little effect. The shorthand is putting the first 1 million people in prison is probably a lot more effective than the second 1 million, said Oliver Reeder, the report's co-author. Once we get to the 2 millionth prisoner, we've in a sense sort of run out of people for whom it will buy us any sort of public safety gains. This report amplifies what many on the left and the right have come to realize in recent years. Mass incarceration is not working, said the report co-author and the Brennan Center's Justice Program Director, Inamai Shetar. The prison explosion has been very expensive. A better use of public resources would be improving economic opportunities, supporting 21st century policing practices, and expanding treatment and rehabilitation programs, all of which have proven records of reducing crime without incarceration's high costs. All right. Financially, we are paying for this at rates higher than ever before. The Washington Post reported this past July that an analysis of federal data by the U.S. Education Department showed state and local spending on incarceration has grown 3 times as much as spending on public education since 1980. The report said, a variety of studies have suggested that investing more in education, particularly targeted toward at-risk communities, could achieve crime reduction without the heavy social costs that high incarceration rates impose on individuals, families, and communities. As for rehabilitation, a 2002 survey showed a recidivism rate of over 50%, with 67.5% of those released being rearrested within just 3 years and 51.8% of them back in prison. All of this tells us that we have a prison system that is not working to keep people out of prison or help them to stop committing crimes when they're in there. One solution that has been proposed to deal with this is private, for-profit prisons. This is a setup where the government contracts a third party and pays them a per diem or monthly rate, either for each prisoner they hold or for the property itself, whether it is occupied or not. This idea is not new. Convict leases were created as far back as 1844 in Louisiana, and this idea really took off after the Civil War. Plantations and businessmen needed to find replacements for the slaves that had been freed and looked to prisons as a potential labor force. It could be lucrative for the states. In 1898, some 73% of Alabama's entire annual state revenue came from convict leasing. According to historian Alex Lichtenstein in his book, Twice the Work of Free Labor, quote, only in the South did the state entirely give up its control to the contractor, and only in the South did the physical penitentiary become virtually synonymous with the various private enterprises in which convicts labored. Leon Litwack wrote that corruption, lack of accountability, and racial violence resulted in one of the harshest and most exploitive labor systems known in American history. African Americans, mostly adult males, due to vigorous and selective enforcement of laws and discriminatory sentencing, made up the vast majority, but not all, of the convicts leased. If that doesn't sound familiar, it should, because that is what's going on right now. The practice of convict leasing peaked around 1880, was formally outlawed by the last state, Alabama, in 1928, and persisted in various forms until it was abolished by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. However, with the expanding prison population in the 1980s, corporations who had previously just contracted out food prep, transportation, and medical services saw an opportunity to take over the whole thing. In 1984, the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, was given the very first contract in the U.S. to run an entire prison in Hamilton County, Tennessee. They went for taking over the entire state prison system, but that bid was denied. Regardless, CCA profits have increased by 500% over the past 2 decades. 2 other major corporations have gotten involved in this industry: the Geo Group, Inc., and Management and Training Corporation, MTC. In 2011, the revenue in this industry totaled $5 billion. This is clearly a growth enterprise, so much so that Wall Street took notice and companies such as Wells Fargo, GE, Fidelity Investments, and the Vanguard Group have invested millions or even hundreds of millions of dollars in private prisons. It's a big business. To the surprise of the students at Columbia University in 2013, they found that their school owned $8 million in CCA stock. The university sold this off by June 2015 because of the student outcry. As it breaks down now, 8.4% of the overall U.S. prison population are in private prisons, with 19.1% of the federal prisoners and 6.8% of the larger U.S. state prison population, and these percentages have been steadily rising. MuckRock is a U.S.-based organization which assists anyone in filing government requests for information through the Freedom of Information Act, then publishes the returned information on its website and tries to get journalist attention to that information. We could spend an entire show on just the problems and abuses surrounding the Freedom of Information Act requests and how difficult it is to get public information out of some of our government agencies. MuckRock was created to help facilitate that. Beryl Lipton is a reporter for MuckRock. She started the Private Prison Project in July 2014 and has been writing about it ever since, with a series of articles exposing corruption, greed, incompetence, and government-private sector collusion to keep people behind bars for the purposes of profit. So, here is my interview with Beryl. First off, now you're a reporter for MuckRock, and can you just give a little background as to what MuckRock is and how you got started on this prison project?
Yeah, absolutely. So MuckRock has been around for a little over 6 years at this point, and I've been with MuckRock for about 3 years. And MuckRock is a collaborative news site. So we sort of exist in three parts. We are a service that helps people file public records requests, including Freedom of Information Act requests. We, as part of that service, post everything online so that people can see all of the back and forth that takes place during a FOIA request, and also so people on the internet can have access to the documents people have already requested, so people don't necessarily have to be doing double the work. We also work in sort of an advocacy capacity. We're a nonprofit, and we're obviously very pro open access, public records, the conversation between citizens and government. So sort of in an ideal world, we're planning for our own obsolescence, because in an ideal world, there doesn't need to sort of be a mediator or a chairperson for these interactions. They just go totally, totally smoothly. And then sort of it's the dream that we have to sort of keep building toward. And then we are also a news outlet. So part of the goal that our founders, Michael and Mitchell, initially had was to create a news source that didn't need to rely on advertising and could rely on people participating in the news creation process, and sort of help feed news in that way, as opposed to relying on sort of corporate sponsors. Of course, we do, take donations and get grants, et cetera, but those are sort of our three areas of main interest, and they're sort of big areas, and they all come together to make MuckRock.
Excellent. What's up with that name, by the way, MuckRock?
Well, so Michael and Mitchell were, the joke our editor likes to say is that it's what happens when you let a 26-year-old name a journalism startup. I personally find the name very endearing. It has edge to it. It's got a play on words. Not the most clever pun in the world, but it's a pun that has a solid muckraking basis. So.
Excellent.
That's where MuckRock comes from. I think people were a little skeptical at first because the name can be, you're unclear what you do at MuckRock.
Well, it's definitely not self-identifying. Yeah.
No, but it's, as my long-winded sort of description of the company showed, it's not easy necessarily to self-describe as a whole. So.
No, for sure. But it's very heroic work, because Freedom of Information Act is something the United States has that a lot of other countries don't have. It's a very, very important issue. Providing transparency at government agencies, and but you have to push for it. They don't just give the information out, and in fact you have to pay for it often.
Yeah, it's a very powerful law if you look at it sort of in the abstract. If you say, like, here is a law that enables the people to be questioning their government, that enables them to be asking for records, which can hold a lot of information, obviously. And it's really a shame that that it's been around for 50 years and it's sort of only now getting mainstream attention. And it, I think, goes to show sort of how much of the existing power structure is allowed to be maintained simply by apathy or ignorance, even when there is a mechanism in place that theoretically could be pushing back against that.
Exactly. I think that apathy and ignorance those are important things we have to, educate the public about so they know they have these rights, And so I wanted to bring that up as a point before we got into the rest of this. So, okay, so I've outlined the problem in pretty broad strokes with the prison situation and with privatization. And so let's just dive right into this now and talk about financial incentives and profit motivation behind prisons. How do these corporations, or these big three corporations that basically are running this, how do they benefit the communities they're housed in, and why would these communities actually invite privatized prisons into their areas? What's the game there?
Well, I mean, it's sort of a big question, but I think if we're going to talk about it in sort of summaries, a lot of towns maybe don't have resources. They don't have um, they don't have anything maybe to invest in their town that they can depend on in the long term. And so when you allow a corporation to come in, you have terms. They say they're going to stay there, they're going to give you jobs, they're going to pay your taxes, they're investing in your community, and then you feel as though they are invested in your community. Unfortunately, what happens in a lot of times is that the corporation can look at the country sort of as a whole. They can say, here is a place that needs a corporate sponsor. Here is a place that needs a corporate sponsor. We have these various metrics by which we determine a good area that we're going to try to put a prison in. And these areas aren't necessarily thinking of it in the same way. When a corporation approaches you and says, we'd like to do something with you, you don't assume you are just one of a rotating pack that they maybe have on their board. But that is the case. It's a business. So as invested as you may think that they are in your town, you have to understand that it's a transactional relationship, and if you aren't the more powerful in that relationship, when tides turn, generally, sort of as we're seeing now with the national discussion around private prisons and the BOP deciding they don't really want to be using private prisons anymore, the towns that these prisons are in sort of become scapegoats to a certain extent in a much bigger problem that they were just a cog in. So.
Right. What comes to mind are Walmarts. Walmart comes in rolling into a town, and they've gotten a bit of bad press and a bad reputation because, it's Walmart, and they don't pay their employees well, and they don't, take care of people really. They are a business first, and that's what they're about, is profit and profit to the shareholders. And I guess these prison corporations are similar, the same sort of thing. They'll make all these promises to the community. Well, we'll do this, we'll do this, we'll do this. But I think if you probably examine the language of the contracts, you find, well, those promises sound good, but when the rubber meets the road, they're not really obligated to do a whole lot of anything except what's good for them.
Right. And that isn't to say, that there aren't people who are working for these companies who actually do care about some of these towns and that isn't to say that they don't have meaningful relationships with some of the local officials there. But exactly as you say, at the end of the day, it's a business, and the way that they've written the contracts is always going to be in their favor until the government pushes back and says, no, we actually need a few more things from you before we'll agree to this.
Right.
And
Right.
I think a lot of what happens in these small towns is that as much as they need is simply a little bit of a kickback. And that's sort of what they're expecting. And I think what the conversation is trying to be more of now is saying we need sort of more moral and rehabilitative elements in these contracts. Otherwise, they're not doing the sort of social good that we would expect them to as people entering into contracts with governments.
Right. Good point. Okay, well, what is the for-profit model? How are these corporations organized, and how do they answer to their shareholders at the end of the day on this stuff, on keeping prisoners?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the shareholders, and you can look at the SEC filings, and that's primarily what I've done to get a sense of how they're talking to their shareholders. But they do have to talk about things in sort of money and money terms. And I think for the general population, that can be really unsettling because, um, for example, one of the things that I find most alarming in the SEC filings is when they break down how many man days they've been paid for. And so man days are the number of like human days that have been spent and that they've been compensated for. And then when you see this number, which is like tens of millions of man days a year, you get this sort of visceral sense of that's a lot of human power being being paid for. Um,
Mhm.
and so, I don't think for a long time the shareholders necessarily had um, a lot of them an ethical or moral problem with the private prison system, because it just seemed as though we weren't going to have another option for prisons anyway. And in the 90s and even into the aughts, prisons, and even now, prisons, less now, but prisons were a hot commodity. People were saying, invest in prisons. You want a sure investment, you can invest in these private prisons,
Mhm.
which now seems insane, but at the time was a very good investment, as you can tell by just how much money these corporations are making. And it's sort of turned into an ongoing investment in even as the popular opinion towards private prisons has changed because the prison corporations are able to sort of shift their model. So whereas before they were primarily taxed as a service, they're now taxed as real estate. So they're effectively.
Yeah. Yeah, could you talk about that little transition they did? Because that was kind of interesting to me in reading through your articles about that.
Yeah, it's curious to try to look at this, what I see as being a very human problem. I see it as sort of a microcosm of the Wall Street, Main Street problem, which I feel like I've said over and over again. But it's very much a system where you can see how the way people on Wall Street think super affect how the actual bodies of people on Main Street are affected. Um, and so uh, for a while, they had been trying to change their sort of tax structure to become these real estate investment trusts, which effectively make them hotels that have a separate arm that is a service. So this means sort of more payback for shareholders.
It's
It
a
also
service, all
means
right.
it also
Wow.
means that there are certain protections if they file for bankruptcy because all of their contracts are removed. They are at least going to be able to keep a lot of their real estate. And so they're able to sort of compartmentalize their investments so that if anything does go super wrong, they'll at least be kind of protected, which is a protection that normal people don't have in terms of being compartmentalizing your assets.
Right. Yeah, I know those corporation things. Now, how do they, from what you've read and seen and experienced over the last couple of years in working on this, what is it that determines their profits? How do they measure success in terms of for-profit prisons?
Well, the primary ways that they're measuring success on the government end is sometimes whether or not they're saving money, but primarily whether or not they're meeting their contract obligations. And their contract obligations are typically limited to fulfilling their American Correctional Association standard requirements and saving some money, being able to afford to run a prison. And these are like the main requirements I've seen in a lot of these calls, because what the government really needs is somebody who is qualified to run a prison and who can run that prison for cheaper. That's primarily what they're looking for. So that's how they're measured on the government end. How they're measured on the corporation end is whether or not they're making money on these deals. And so how they're making money on those deals,
Hmm.
however, is a little more unclear. And we've seen lots and lots and lots of stories of various cost cutting, understaffing. You know, they won't have to make, you know, if they buy an old building to make into a prison, they'll be able to get a waiver on like standards if that prison is too small because they super need a prison in that area. Um, so there are lots of ways that they can get around expenses that the government doesn't have for itself. And so that's sort of how the two sides are measuring success. Are those appropriate ways of measuring success? Well, I think now we're discussing, right, rehabilitation. You know, I think the
Right.
early selling points had a lot of these other measures of success in there. You know, talking about how there will be lower recidivism rates if people go to private prisons. And what we're seeing actually is that, like, we don't have measures. We're not measuring these things in any sort of basically scientific way. So we can't really say that they are saving money. We can't really say that their prisoners are returning to prison less often. We can sort of say that there are a lot of seemingly bad things going on in private prisons. And, you know, it seems like one of those situations where if they would be more forthcoming with some of their information, maybe people wouldn't be so opposed to implementing them in our systems. But as it is, they've been so secretive and have openly opposed being less secretive on so many occasions
Right.
that one does become suspicious.
Exactly, and it is telling, and probably telling of the bigger problem outside of just privatization, but the prison system in general. That it is not that recidivism rates and rehabilitation rates are not hardly part of the conversation at all. You know.
Right. I think they seem like a problem with both the way, honestly, that America does contracting and privatization generally, and also a problem with prisons, right, overall. Because as long as our public prison system is as bad as it is, private prisons have been able to have the fallback of, well, look how bad they're doing it.
Exactly. But the standard is the bar is set so low that they really are hotels,
Right.
with bars on the doors and windows, and that's as that we've come to that level of primitive handling of people,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not. And I've wondered in going into this topic, and I didn't spend a lot of time on this, but I've sort of had this idea that because of the other countries do it differently. And I'm not grandstanding or getting on a bandwagon right now about how wonderful Sweden is and how wonderful Denmark is, and oh, if we only did that, because yeah, I think those are apples and oranges comparisons, because those countries are very different culturally. Police, everything is different there, and
Mm-hmm.
the whole cultural attitude is different there. They're not the United States. Also, the number of their population is different. But that being said, I do think our Puritan roots really come through in our prison system with the eye for an eye mentality that we have about prisoners and about people who commit crime. And then, of course, the war on drugs and mandatory sentencing and three strikes laws have just filled up these prisons in the
Mm-hmm.
80s, and it's just kind of gone more out of control, not more under control, you know.
Yeah, I don't know if culturally as a country we have just not felt we've had the mind space, or perhaps we just have not had the empathy to deal with prisons in a big way. But prisons aren't going away. We've had prisons for a very long time, and it sort of seems like the foundational system, to my mind, in a lot of ways, of a society, sort of the place where you put people who you've deemed unfit for society, and like deciding where you draw that line should be taken very seriously, and
Yes.
particularly in a country that claims rights to freedoms, as we would love to do all of the time. Um, yeah, so I Absolutely. To compare us to other countries in a lot of ways would be absolutely inappropriate because the populations those countries are dealing with are just totally different and they don't necessarily have the same social dynamics that we do. But I think there absolutely are ways that we can be implementing some things from around the world.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the problems that I have with American exceptionalism is that in a way, I think that if you are sort of truly exceptional, you can hear other ideas and not feel threatened by them,
Right.
is an
Right.
exceptional quality.
Absolutely. And I think in looking into this further, I think that comparisons could be made. I only say those things because I don't want to hear in the comments section about, oh, if we only did what Denmark does. I don't want to hear it because it's not the same, right? It's kind of like hearing about how, the minimum wages and people at McDonald's earn $20 an hour in Denmark, and you're like, well, okay, but, but, and then it kind of becomes this useless talking point. But I do think, for sure, when it comes to criminal rehabilitation, we have things to learn from other countries that are benefiting from less recidivism and better rehabilitation techniques.
Yeah, and I feel like what you see in terms of rehabilitation. Well, there's some education, but I don't think education is as prevalent in prisons as I would like to see it,
Mm-hmm.
by far.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a lot of the big issues that we sort of hear right now, sort of solitary confinement and inmate labor, and these are leftovers from when people were trying to rehabilitate people in much more religious and different times, and
Mm-hmm.
we haven't readjusted. And it's interesting to me, I think we have the benefit of the internet and Skype conversations and instant gratification in that way. But it's interesting that people haven't prior to this been able to sort of take a step back and say, like, what are we doing here, and like how often should we reevaluate this in a significant way. And it's nice now to be, as depressing as the news is all the time, at least to be in a society where these conversations are happening every day on like all sorts of levels, and to know that that is part of the common discourse, like at least you can feel like a little more hopeful about things.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the work you're doing, for example, is very, very important in that regard. Putting out these FOIA requests, getting this information back, publicizing it, making it known. I mean, I wouldn't, have 80% of the information I have as I sit here right now, had it not been for the work you've been doing.
Yeah.
So it's very, very important. And I think getting it out there on social media or not social media, but on the internet,
Hmm.
very important stuff.
After these messages, we'll be right back.
Hey there. I just want to take a moment to let you know about a new website that I think you might find useful. I'm sure those of you who are listening to the show right now have been wondering about this mug sitting here that says Got Logic. And those of you who are watching are wondering, where do I get logic? How do you get your fill? Well, fortunately for you, I have the answers. Introducing the Critical Merchandise Web Store, hosted by Spreadshirt.com. If you think that facts matter, that critical thinking is not just for breakfast anymore, and you want to let your friends know that their lack of logic is disturbing, then you need look no further than the Critical Merchandise website. By popular demand, I've put these products together for you guys, and I think you'll find all of them helpful and useful reminders to yourself and to others that sense, logic, and reason are something all of us could use a little bit more of in our lives. Check out Critical Merchandise Store by either using the link below on this channel or by looking on sensiblyspeaking.com at the Critical Merchandise link at the top of the page. 100% of the funds raised from your purchases go back to making this show and my YouTube channel a reality, and I really do appreciate your support. Check out Critical Merchandise today. Speaking of FOIA requests, does lead me to my next question here, and I was a little surprised by this, and I probably shouldn't have been. But because these are private corporations, they're not really subject to FOIA requests the same way that the government is, even though the government is contracting them to do a government-mandated service. And I found that interesting that that didn't apply to them.
Yeah, the private prison system has definitely offered a lens into the general inefficiencies that exist in our government, because as often as these exist sort of policy-wise in private prisons, this is sort of applicable to a lot of other private enterprises, that, you know, the sort of the same approach that I took to private prisons, somebody could easily take to, you know, an energy company that they're interested in, or a pipeline company that they're interested in.
That's right.
So yeah, it's interesting that the main competitor of these private prisons in terms of that industry is the government. And so you have the government both like paying other people to do its job and also like short selling itself somehow in this process. The government is not really leveraging the power it has, which is all of it, as the primary consumer of this good. But yeah, so until very, very recently, until this summer, actually, they were protecting even information like unit price, so like the per diem price per day of keeping people in particular facilities. And a lot of this, they say, you know, it's applicable to other industries. So they do get trade secrets, because if other companies knew how much their product costs, then they could compare and they could come and underbid them, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in a way, you can understand why in the total abstract, there is the privacy exemption for certain corporate secrets. But when you're dealing with something like prisons that deal with actual human beings, the actual citizens that the government is actually supposed to be protecting, it's basically its function,
Right.
then you're running into real problems. It's the clash between capitalism and democracy is hot in private prisons.
It is, and it is very interesting. I think the opposing views on these sorts of things, the capitalistic sort of view versus the, you know, the pro-corporate view versus the pro-public has a right to know views, and the considerations that come up on this stuff. It's really not as simple as it sounds.
Right. But I think, I think that, part of what really attracted me to private prisons, there are lots of things that I find sort of fascinating about this system that is allowed to exist. But one of the things was that, a lot of people have been sort of fighting private prisons in their own towns using public records. And a lot of people have the same questions. A lot of people in all 30 plus states where private prisons exist, want to know more about these. And they haven't been able to sort of, I don't want to sell anybody short, but I just, again, in my sort of ideal world where everybody has the access to all of the questions and all of, the information they need to answer those questions for themselves, if one person trying to, stir up some interest in this can get this far, what can other people do, with MuckRock, with the power of public records, with this sort of idealistic mindset that can help to push things forward.
Well, that's a good point. And also another corollary to this is third-party oversight, and the fact that prisons are supposed to be, I mean, they're paid for with tax dollars. They are definitely a public interest item. I mean, public should be interested in what's happening in them and around them and having to do with them, because the public are paying for them. So the fact that they're not as readily accessible for FOIA requests or for information makes it very, very difficult for third-party oversight to occur. And your project has been a demonstration of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like one of the things that I wanted to highlight with this project is just how much is done totally legally and out in the open that people would find horrifying if they knew about it. Just the very existence of private prisons causes a lot of people to blanch. So, there's a lot going on that we don't have to feel totally hopeless about, because the mechanisms, we are an educated populace. We can sort of fight back. We can use the tools that the powers that be have given to us, for better or worse, to try to make this system sort of more to our liking. And so that was definitely something that I wanted to highlight with the project, is just how much isn't isn't known, isn't accessible, but that they'll have to keep telling you no until it becomes an issue. The other thing I wanted to say, oh goodness, well, it slipped me now.
Don't worry, it'll come back to you, and we'll just bring it up when it does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the oversight issue is not an insignificant one, and I do want to highlight, for those of you out there who are watching this right now who have not ever heard of MuckRock, not ever checked this sort of thing out before, don't even know much about Freedom of Information Act requests, except it's something you sort of hear about on the news every now and again. Check it out, because we are the ones who make that happen as citizens. If we don't take advantage of those laws and those those freedoms that we have, then they get taken away. Is what happens.
Right. It's sort of the double-edged sword of being a democracy, where all of the great you can sort of take pride in, and all of the bad you should also feel ashamed about. That is sort of what happens.
Exactly. And if people could get that when it's not a matter of running down the U.S. or talking shit about it, or why don't you move somewhere else? That's so not the point.
Mm-hmm.
The
Right.
point is that
I'm like, it's comparable. I mean, not quite comparable, but say you're trying to lose weight or something, like it doesn't necessarily have to be an insecurity thing. You can just say, like, I would like it better like this. Now I'm going to do this thing. I will work towards that goal. I have accomplished it. I feel better now. It wasn't that I think I'm a terrible person. This is all of the other people are better than I am. It's just I would like to be better for myself. And as a
exactly.
country, if we could, do that, that would be great.
Exactly. All right. Now, it's interesting.
Oh,
Go
I
ahead.
actually did remember what I was going to talk about,
Yeah.
having to do with third-party oversight. If I could just sort of tangentially talk about, just government oversight in these private situations, because I think another thing that has sort of caused apathy or sort of paralyzed the debate is the idea that there is actual oversight happening. And I think if people were to maybe follow up on some of the oversight that they think is happening, they would find that no oversight is happening. So there have been situations, where states have said that they were going to have like a use of force audit. Well, they didn't have the use of force audit, but I asked for it, and it was sort of after that they were prodded to actually carry through. Or there have been boards set up to measure how cost effective private prisons are. And then representatives will come in and say, well, that actually drives up the cost of the contract. So then they won't be cost effective anymore. So people are getting rid of oversight in favor of lower contract costs, sort of undermining the point of the oversight and the contract altogether.
It's,
We're in a strange logical knot, but this is how
no,
it
I see it, and it seems that this particular area, maybe maybe if we were talking about privatized education or privatized hospitals, we'd be in a whole different level of we'd be having a very different conversation when it comes
yeah.
to oversight. But when it comes to prisoners, people just kind of roll their eyes, whatever, you know.
Right.
And they really do seem to miss the human factor. And I'm not talking about just being some bleeding heart liberal. I'm just talking about the recognition that these are human beings, and that a vast number of them, I think at this point a majority of the people who are locked up, are there for nonviolent offenses.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the total numbers are on it, but I think there are too many people are locked up for reasons that don't come down to being a danger to society,
Right.
rather being an inconvenience to oneself maybe.
Exactly. And I mentioned in the intro the fact that you have laws being passed now where in 4 states in the U.S., for example, marijuana is now illegal, now legal, medicinally and recreationally. Yet not one prisoner has been released who's there for having possessed marijuana. Right? They're
Hmm.
still behind bars in those states.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I was talking with one of my friends who's a law student, and we were trying to understand how to codify empathy into sort of legal terms,
Mm-hmm.
because um, it's confusing to me. I think initially when I started this project and I started looking at the prison system, it was astounding that people didn't understand that, like, not only are 2+ million people in prison, but that has ripple effects into their families, their immediate families, their communities. It really hurts everyone when there are people in their sphere who are hurt. And so I think, now we're finally able to have this conversation because just so many people have somebody in their sphere that has been hurt by this system, that now people have to understand, oh, it has affected me. This is now a problem. But it was always going to be a problem if you don't care for your fellow citizen. That was always going to be a problem.
You got it. Exactly. Is this that's the social issue at hand here. Now, it's interesting. Let's talk about another aspect of this. It's interesting that if you put all this on a map, which you've done, that the majority of these groups are scattered throughout the southern parts of the U.S. From the east to the west, it's the southern band of the United States that contains most of these. And yet, that's not really, though, an accurate reflection of where the prison population, the private prison populations, are coming from, because they do these inner transfers and whatnot that happen. I don't think people really realize that. Let's talk about that for a second, just to raise awareness on it.
Right. So the private prison population is coming from, right, not only the southern states where a lot of these prisons are located, they're also coming from states like Hawaii and Vermont, which don't necessarily have enough space in their own prison systems. And so they have outsourced their prisoners to other facilities. They're also coming, a lot of them, from out of the country. A lot of them are immigrants. Who are either, who are here for whatever reason, and who are either going to be deported or detained until we understand what we're better going to do with our immigration policies. Right. So you'll also find that there are on the books private prison laws in a lot of states that don't currently have private prisons. So, for example, I am in Massachusetts. Massachusetts does not have private prisons, but we legally could have had a private prison because initially the sort of game plan was to get this at least legalized in as many states as possible in case you wanted to bring in a private prison. And you sort of see the same strategy. You see the same strategy in a lot of different situations. So, for example, with the NRA, if you go state by state, by the time it hits the federal level, people will be more likely to be on board because all of these states have already passed laws like this. Why not at the federal level? And so basically, if you can get as much foundational legal support as possible, you're sort of allowed to push these things forward. And that's sort of what happened in the 80s when this was growing.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay, now another instance of this, and this is something you probably had. I've saw spots of places where you had quoted from reports and from even in prisoners or prison employees' own handwriting, attempts they made to be whistleblowers or attempts they made to show the state of the conditions in some of these prisons, right? And this isn't, again, this isn't like some big, huge liberal sympathy plea for like, oh, all these poor prisoners, because yes, there are people there who deserve to be there. However, there's this little thing called cruel and unusual punishment. It's this little tiny thing in our Constitution. It's just this little, just a little Eighth Amendment.
This is one of those constitutional things.
Not a big deal. It's only, a Bill of Rights. But you mentioned that the Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that the Eighth Amendment on that cruel and unusual restriction, that punishment restriction, couldn't be brought against employees of privately owned correction facilities. Now, I was shocked by that because doesn't that seem to open the door for these guys to be able to rain all kinds of abuses down on these prisoners without being called to the carpet on that?
I would think so. And I think like the thinking behind it was that if you can start prosecuting somebody who is doing their job as an agent of a contractor, then you can start doing that sort of all over the board, which becomes, again, is like one of those like corporate corporations dealing with private citizens' problems, because absolutely it seems as though once you introduce the profit motive into this situation, a lot of the things that they're doing seem very strange. So there's that. There's the fact that, and you probably read about this, that grievances are handled in private prisons just as they are in public prisons. This is one of the earliest things that I found that honestly horrified me. Because if you're in a private prison and you are complaining about the same people to whom you then have to give your grievance,
Right.
you are not going to get a lot of help. And
Right.
if it is, and if that employee also happens to have stock in that company, then that employee super doesn't want to solve your grievance and doesn't want to bring that up to management and definitely doesn't want the press to know about it, because this person is directly financially invested in the system in which they happen to be maybe doing something inappropriate. So yeah, the divide on cruel and unusual punishment, as it pertains to private prisons, is interesting, because I mean, it's hard to say more abuses happen in private prisons, but we are more directly paying somebody else to do that and expecting to hold them accountable for mess ups.
Yeah, I don't mean to, by the question, I'm certainly not implying that private prisons are more abusive, because we statistically have no idea if they are or not. And once you start looking into, the life of your, run-of-the-mill prisoner in your run-of-the-mill any town, any prison USA, that's horrifying enough.
Mm-hmm.
It's bad enough. And that the cultural, view of prisoners, you're going to go in there, don't bend over, the whole how pedophiles are dealt with. Everybody just kind of smiles and goes, thank goodness, they're going to get theirs.
Mm-hmm.
And all of what they're talking about actually are violations of the Eighth Amendment. Right?
Absolutely. And I think that that's something that people don't necessarily take as seriously as they should, is that
Right.
prisons are an agent of the state, and we live in a democracy. So, that state is representing us. And even if the person who's going into jail did something horrific, what we have prescribed is a certain punishment for a certain crime, not all these extrajudicial punishments that happen to come along with going to prison.
That's
And
right.
the fact that those are allowed to occur with impunity should be terrifying to the rest of us, because who knows when else that could happen. And it may not inconvenience us now, but as soon as it does, we're going to find that the system is really unforgiving.
Exactly. It's almost a matter of, I mean, I don't want to just say this in so broadly, but it's definitely been on my mind when you start researching this, that it's almost like rehabilitation is an accident.
Mm-hmm.
It's an accident if it happens.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
I don't know whether to say, society didn't understand itself well enough to be able to help others in a useful way. I don't know that we're even able to do that now, but at least there is some sort of intent to consider maybe that other people aren't totally hopeless just because they've come from circumstances that have been less than favorable.
Exactly. Yeah, luck has a factor. Luck is a factor in people's lives and their upbringing. You don't get to choose what family you're born into. You don't get to choose what class or economic level you're born into,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just not a fact of life that everybody in the United States has the same opportunities.
Right. Yeah,
Has the same
it's
breaks.
certainly not a fact. And I perhaps whatever naivete this suggests, but I genuinely believe that most people are trying to do good, and they, perhaps they had bad models, perhaps they've had like influences that had bad models, but I think if you nurture a little more, it's possible. Now, we certainly don't have enough resources to nurture everybody to the extent that they need to be nurtured, but we can at least recognize that's a factor. And I recently went to the American Correctional Association conference, which was very interesting.
Mm.
Um,
Please
and I went to,
comment on that.
huh?
Please comment on that.
Yeah, well, I want to say one of the more interesting and sort of heartening things that I saw was a particular conversation on trauma, trauma recognition, and just the idea that the people that you are encountering in the correctional environment have at one time or another, either in their childhood or, in their adolescence, or just in the fact that they ended up in prison to begin with, have been traumatized in some way. And if you can try to interact with these people as people who have been hurt, and are just basically trying to survive this thing we call life, as opposed to people who are monsters, then you can get a lot further with them. And this seems to me just a basic human interaction, thing. But, the fact that they're at least talking about that and trying to implement that into policy is sort of optimistic.
Big time. Now, one last comment on this business with the rights and the abuses and whatnot that go on is this is also in terms of, we're not just talking about affecting prisoners, we're also talking about the effects on the employees, guards, right, administrators, people who work in these prisons. For example, and this was, again, just another one of those things that surprised me, even though it probably shouldn't have, OSHA requirements, the Office of Safety and Occupational Safety and Hazard Association, sorry. So OSHA has requirements for all levels of businesses, construction, if you're working, you're supposed to be safe. And yet there's a lot of things that OSHA doesn't have rules or regulations for when it comes to prisons. And I was just floored by that. And
and I mean, I think it partly probably has to do with just what a difficult work environment a prison is. It's sort of inherently dangerous when you're dealing with sort of unstable individuals or people who have been placed in that situation, even if they weren't unstable before they got there.
Right.
Once they got there, maybe they're upset. So
maybe a little bit.
Yeah. But right, so this is just another one of those sort of things that seems to fall through the cracks, and it highlights another one of those things that is important for people to know and to understand when they start trying to push back on their government, is that there are just tiny holes that if people just pointed them out, maybe something would get done about them. Because this sort of seems like common sense sorts of things. But once we have a conversation, if OSHA starts talking more to the Bureau of Prisons, starts talking more to, like the Department of Health, I have to believe we just have so many smart, good people in this country that if a few of them got together and said, hey, we all care about this thing, maybe we can try to fix it, like that we could get somewhere with that.
You are such an optimist.
You sort of have, at a certain point, you have to be, because to look down who knows what's down there? We're talking about private prisons right now.
Exactly.
It could be so much worse.
No, I share your optimism. I actually do. Although, sometimes the world tests you.
Absolutely.
Especially on this kind of stuff. Now, very recently, there was news about President Obama canceling use of federal prisons or private prisons at the federal level, and this was kind of headline news very recently. What can you say about that?
So the headlines were really misleading, and I was excited to hear that they were making moves on the issue. But I was also disappointed. So I'm sorry to not be a total a cheerleader for this move, but I thought it did a lot to illustrate sort of what I find misleading about headlines and news generally. So, for example, the fact President Obama ends private prisons. I saw that headline. President Obama did not end private prisons. The deputy director of the Department of Justice said that they were going to try to cut back on private prisons, and not even in the entire Department of Justice. It was just the Bureau of Prisons, so that doesn't cover, it doesn't cover other federal agencies, so Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection. U.S. Marshals Service uses private prisons, so it doesn't really. President Obama did not end private prisons.
Right.
Somebody else said that we were going to slowly stop trying to use as many private prisons. And so, things like that sort of bother me, because then people think that we don't have private prisons anymore. Then you see people say, oh, I didn't even know we had private prisons. I'm so glad that they are gone.
Right. Right. This is
And then you end up with
this is the problem, folks, with getting your news off headlines.
mm-hmm.
Is sound bites and headlines are not the story. They're not even up. They're half the time they're just total bullshit. And until you dig in and read the story, and then even when you've read the story, you still only have a little tiny bit. This is where that three-dimensional thinking I've talked about before comes in. Is you got to look past the surface level, past the headline. And I knew you could talk about this more intelligently. Why even make such an announcement? I mean, it seems that it is a bit of a hot topic item. Private prisons. How is this? I'm wondering. Not to roll the answer back to, well, it's all because of you, Beryl, but but I think increasing awareness of this issue has made this more of a hot topic item. But what's your sense from all the work you've done on this as to public perception and media perception and where this is going?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so I think that there's a lot of potential here in terms of building off of this excitement, because I think that there's also in sort of the current environment, this understanding that the headline maybe isn't the whole story. People are consistently feeling duped, and I think that was a lot behind the push for Bernie Sanders, was that people were excited about the fact that people weren't trying to trick them. And so,
I
I
have
think,
no comment on the matter.
yeah.
I even mention politics and people just want to annihilate me. So.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I won't ask you to speak on it.
Oh no, it's okay for you to do it. I can't do it.
Yeah, so I think, and recently there has been a lot more conversation. So there were a few really big things. Bernie Sanders brought it up. Hillary Clinton has brought it up. It got brought up against her. So, it's an election season. People don't want to say this woman gets her money from secret black sites that keep farm African Americans as slaves. That's not a great campaign slogan for her.
Nope.
Um,
Nope.
so there was that. Mother Jones put out a really big piece on the experience of working at a private prison. And then,
That's right. That's right.
mhm. And then the Office of the Inspector General came out with a really big report on the Bureau of Prisons. And again, here's where I feel a little cynical or skeptical about the way that data is read. So there were a lot of really flashy things in this Inspector General report. For example, far more contraband cell phones at private prisons, more inmate assaults at private prisons, things like this. But it's really hard to figure out where they got those numbers, what those numbers mean, right? So the fact that they confiscate more cell phones at private prisons, is it that they are letting in more cell phones? Is it that they are better at confiscating cell phones than public prisons? It's hard to know what this information actually means. It's much easier to see how it's going to be used, and it was used to make this big statement that the Department of Justice wasn't going to use private prisons anymore. So I think, it's topics like this where as soon as you have people's attention, I think people in the government, people in the media like to jump on it and try to get as much mileage out of it as possible. Sort of what I was afraid of, and I think sort of what MuckRock likes to do, is that once the headlines have passed, we like to stay on a story. We like to, keep these projects open. We want people to consistently be returning to these stories because not everybody has the time or the attention to be able to continually investigate even subjects that they care very much about. People have a lot of other things that they are trying to do in their lives. But if people are willing to, take a, chip away at it a little bit at a time, maybe somebody will come along who can build on that work and push the issue forward. So.
Right. Well, I think our overcrowded and far too abundant prison population, 2.2 million people. I mean, this has generated a lot of interest and of course, like you said, the collateral effects of it are great. So you have more families, more concerned people looking into this, I think, than we've had in a long, long, long time. And so now on MuckRock, all the documentation, everything you've collected, that's all now available. Is that right?
Some of it is still kept. We have an embargo feature, so some of it's still kept under embargo. I have a few things that I'm working on that. So the initial part of the project, which I think of as being what I've done up until this point was sort of laying groundwork and helping me honestly understand how the system works, and just like sort of other basic things like public records laws, how this works in a private public situation, just getting the lay of the land. But I think that there are lots of other opportunities to be prodding at this. So one of the things that I'm excited to be working on has to do with the communications that are taking place between city officials and the private corporations. And this is something that people can do on basically any private corporation that they're interested in that works with the government. They theoretically could be asking for these communications. And so to be able to put this together and see what we can get and how that varies and sort of leverage different requests off of each other going forward will be exciting. But a lot of the stuff is available right now online.
Good. Okay, good. Because in other words, we don't all have to start at square zero.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And if people are interested in helping on the private prison issue and they have questions, I'm more than happy to, if they reach out to me, or my name is Beryl, Beryl, at MuckRock.com. I'd be more than happy to help set people up and try to get something going especially in local areas, because if you'll let me go on another tangent. One of the very exciting things about MuckRock, I think, is that you can ask these same questions in a lot of different answers in different places. And one of the big problems with dealing with mass incarceration is that it's not a monolith. You're not dealing with a centralized agency. You've got an overpopulated county here and here and here, and the people who are going to change that situation and figure out how that situation got that way are the people who are actually there. From my ivory tower in Boston, I'm not going to be able to go basically anywhere else in the country and really engage with this issue on the ground in the way that people who are residents there and care about it can engage with it. And so it's really important for people to be looking at this in their own backyards and seeing, our prisoners in my area being treated as I would expect them to be.
Right. Good. Excellent. So your plans then are clearly to continue with this project.
Yeah, so the project led to a lot of other sort of spin-offs. So looking at privatization in other areas, sort of gathering the groundwork for other people's works in terms of, we've been asking about prisoner transportation, which the Marshall Project had done a big story on. We are looking at pay-to-stay policies. We're looking at cell phone policies and commissions and sort of how these things work. So we're trying to pick wherever we can at a lot of different things. And then I have a few other things that I'll be working on going forward, but this project will hopefully keep on plugging along.
Great. Okay, good. Well, there's a wealth of information that you've put out already. Anybody who's interested in it, the links, will be below this video and on the podcast site. So I guess we will wrap it up at this point. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, of course. No, it was great speaking with you.
Absolutely. And you guys are doing really good work there. So please do continue.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we'll try to keep it up as long as we can.
Excellent. Well, I hope you found that interview as educational and interesting as I did, because I simply could not believe how bad that situation was with private prisons in the U.S., and some of the issues are definitely of concern. I put links in the show notes to Beryl's email and to the Prison Project files on muckrock.com. Please do check them out if you're at all interested in any further information about this topic. I think you'll find it very, very interesting. I'm very interested in your feedback on this show. Positive, negative, whatever. Go ahead and leave your comments either on my YouTube channel or in the comments section of the sensiblyspeaking.com website. I really, really appreciate you guys coming around and watching. Please do share this show, and if you have not subscribed to my channel, go ahead and do so. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.